The woman standing in the dusty street of Abilene, Kansas, had eyes that spoke volumes in a world where her voice had been stolen. And rancher Cole Garrett felt his heart stop the moment he saw the crude scar tissue where her tongue should have been. It was the summer of 1874, and Cole had ridden into town with a herd of cattle, expecting nothing more than the usual chaos of drovers, saloons, and card games that define the cattle towns of Kansas. He was 26 years old, tall and lean from years of hard work on the open range, with sun-darkened skin and hands calloused from rope and reins. His dark hair hung past his collar, and his eyes were the color of storm clouds, constantly scanning for trouble in a land where danger could come from any direction. He had been moving cattle north from Texas for 3 years now, saving money to buy land of his own, dreaming of a place where he could build something permanent instead of wandering from season to season. The woman caught his attention because she was different from the usual faces in Abilene. She stood outside the general store, her hands moving in quick, desperate gestures as she tried to communicate with the shopkeeper, who looked annoyed and impatient. She wore a simple gray dress that had seen better days, her dark blonde hair pulled back in a braid that fell to her waist. Even from a distance, Cole could see the frustration in her posture, the way her shoulders tensed with each failed attempt to make herself understood. The shopkeeper waved her away dismissively, turning his back on her as she tried one more time to get his attention. Cole saw her hands drop to her sides, saw the defeat in the slump of her shoulders, and something in him reacted without thought. He dismounted from his horse and crossed the street, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. "Excuse me," Cole said, addressing the shopkeeper as he stepped onto the wooden walkway. "This lady trying to buy something," the shopkeeper, a portly man with thinning hair and a permanent scowl, glanced at the woman with obvious distaste. "Can't understand a word she's trying to say." "Been waving her hands around for 10 minutes like some kind of lunatic. I got paying customers to attend to." Cole turned to the woman, and for the first time he looked directly into her eyes. They were remarkable, a shade of green he had never seen before, like spring grass after rain, and they were filled with such intelligence and awareness that he felt almost overwhelmed. She met his gaze steadily, and he saw hope flicker there, mixed with wariness. She had learned not to trust too easily, that much was clear. "Ma'am," Cole said quietly, "I'd like to help if you'll let me." She studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face as if trying to determine whether he was genuine or just another person who would mock her disability. Then slowly she nodded. Her hands came up and she pointed to her mouth, then made a cutting gesture. Cole felt his stomach turn as he understood what she was trying to tell him. "Someone cut out your tongue," he said, and it was not a question. She nodded again, and this time she opened her mouth slightly so he could see the scarred stump where her tongue had been. The mutilation had been done deliberately, probably without any care for her survival or the pain she would endure. Cole felt anger rise in his chest, hot and fierce, at whoever had done this to her. "Can you write?" he asked. She shook her head and he saw frustration flash across her face. Of course she could not write. Most women on the frontier had limited education, and someone who had suffered what she had probably came from circumstances where learning letters had been a luxury she could never afford. "All right," Cole said, thinking quickly. "Point to what you need and I'll help you get it." Relief washed over her features, transforming her face from wary to almost beautiful. She reached out and touched his arm briefly, a gesture of gratitude that felt more meaningful than any words could have been. Then she turned back to the store, and Cole followed her inside. The process was slow but effective. She would point to items, and Cole would ask questions until he understood exactly what she needed. She needed flour, salt, coffee, and a length of fabric. Cole watched as she counted out coins from a small leather pouch, noting that she had very little money. When the shopkeeper tallied up the cost, Cole saw her face fall. She was short by almost $2. Without thinking, Cole pulled out his own money and made up the difference. The woman turned to him with wide eyes, shaking her head vigorously, trying to refuse his help. But Cole just smiled at her, the first real smile he had felt in weeks. "Consider it a loan," he said. "You can pay me back when you're able." She stared at him for a long moment, and then tears filled those remarkable green eyes. She brushed them away quickly, as if ashamed of showing emotion, and nodded her acceptance. Cole helped her carry her purchases outside, and once they were on the street, she stopped and looked at him expectantly, clearly wanting to communicate something important. She touched her chest, then pointed north out of town. She made a gesture like she was stirring a pot, then pointed at Cole and then at the direction she had indicated. It took him a moment to understand. "You're inviting me to dinner?" he asked. "To thank me?" She nodded enthusiastically, and Cole found himself agreeing before he had fully thought it through. He had planned to spend the evening in town, maybe play some cards and have a few drinks with the other drovers. But something about this woman intrigued him, pulled at him in a way he could not explain. He wanted to know her story, wanted to understand how she had ended up alone in a cattle town with no voice and very little money. "I'd be honored," he said, and meant it. She smiled then, a real smile that lit up her entire face, and Cole felt something shift in his chest. He did not know it yet, but his life had just changed direction as surely as if he had turned his horse onto a new trail. They walked together out of town, Cole leading his horse while the woman carried her packages. She led him north along a narrow path that wound through tall grass and scattered cottonwood trees. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the prairie, and the air was heavy with the scent of dust and growing things. They walked in silence, but it was a comfortable silence, not awkward or strained. After about half an hour, they came to a small dugout built into the side of a low hill. It was a modest dwelling, the kind that homesteaders built when they first claimed land, with sod walls and a wooden door. Smoke rose from a chimney pipe, and Cole could see that someone had made an effort to create a small garden beside the entrance, though the plants looked struggling and sparse. The woman opened the door and gestured for Cole to enter. Inside, the dugout was surprisingly clean and well-organized. A narrow bed stood against one wall, covered with a faded quilt. A small table and 2 chairs occupied the center of the room, and a cast-iron stove provided both heat and cooking space. Shelves held a few dishes and supplies, and everything was arranged with careful attention to making the most of the limited space. She set down her packages and immediately began preparing a meal. Cole offered to help, but she shook her head and pointed to one of the chairs, indicating that he should sit. He did, watching as she worked with quick, efficient movements. She built up the fire in the stove, mixed flour and water to make biscuits, and started a pot of beans heating. Her movements were graceful and practiced, and Cole found himself fascinated by the way she navigated her world without the ability to speak. As she cooked, Cole tried to start a conversation, asking simple questions that she could answer with nods or shakes of her head. He learned that she had been living in the dugout for about 3 months. She had no family nearby. She was not from Kansas originally. When he asked if she had come from the South, she nodded, and he saw pain flicker in her eyes. "Was it during the war?" he asked quietly. "When they cut your tongue," she paused in her work, her hands stilling over the pot of beans. Then she turned to face him, and the expression in her eyes was so full of old anguish that Cole regretted asking. But she nodded, confirming his guess, and then she did something unexpected. She came to the table and sat down across from him, and she began to tell him her story. She told it with her hands and her eyes and her expressions, and though Cole did not understand every gesture, he understood enough. She had been a slave on a plantation in Mississippi. She had witnessed her master beating a slave child nearly to death for a minor infraction, and she had spoken up, demanding that he stop. For her defiance, for daring to speak truth to power, the master had ordered her tongue cut out as punishment. She showed Cole the scars on her wrists where she had been tied down while it was done, the marks still visible after all these years. After the war ended and she was freed, she had wandered north, working where she could, saving every penny. She had bought this piece of land with money earned from backbreaking labor, doing laundry and cleaning for anyone who would hire her. This dugout, poor as it was, represented everything she had managed to build for herself. It was freedom, hard-won and precious. Cole listened, his heart breaking for what she had endured. He had seen cruelty during his time in the war, had witnessed things that still haunted his dreams. But there was something particularly vicious about what had been done to her, a deliberate attempt to silence her permanently, to rob her of the most basic human ability to communicate. The fact that she had survived, that she had built a life for herself despite everything, spoke to a strength of spirit that Cole could only admire. "What's your name?" he asked when she had finished her story. She stood and went to the shelf, taking down a small tin box. Inside were a few precious possessions, and she pulled out a piece of paper, yellowed with age. It was a free papers document issued after the war, and written on it in careful script was a name, Eliza Me Johnson. "Eliza," Cole said, trying out the name. "That's a beautiful name." She smiled and nodded, clearly pleased that he had asked, that he cared enough to know what to call her. "I'm Cole Garrett," he said. "I'm a drover moving cattle up from Texas. Been doing it for a few years now, saving money to buy land." Eliza served the meal she had prepared, and they ate together as the sun set outside and the dugout filled with the warm glow of lamplight. The food was simple but good, and Cole found himself relaxing in her company in a way he rarely did with others. There was something peaceful about being with someone who could not fill every silence with chatter, who communicated in deeper ways than mere words. After dinner, Cole helped her clean up, ignoring her protests. As they worked side by side in the small space, he found himself acutely aware of her presence, of the way her shoulder brushed against his arm, of the faint scent of soap and sunshine that clung to her skin. When their hands touched in the wash water, he felt a jolt of something he had not experienced in a very long time. When everything was clean and put away, Cole knew he should leave, should head back to town, and the camp where the other drovers were settling in for the night. But he found himself reluctant to go, reluctant to leave the warmth and peace of this small dugout and the woman who inhabited it. "I should get back," he said finally, reaching for his hat. "But I'd like to see you again if you'd allow it." Eliza looked at him with those expressive green eyes, and he saw surprise there and uncertainty and something else that might have been hope. She nodded slowly, and then she did something that made Cole's heart race. She reached out and placed her hand over his, squeezing gently. "Tomorrow?" he asked. "I could come back tomorrow evening." She nodded again, more confidently this time, and Cole felt a smile spread across his face. "Tomorrow, then," he said. He rode back to town under a sky full of stars, his mind replaying every moment of the evening. He had met plenty of women in his travels, had even courted a few, but none of them had affected him the way Eliza had. There was something about her quiet strength, her resilience in the face of unimaginable cruelty, that drew him to her like a moth to flame. The next day passed with agonizing slowness. Cole went through the motions of his work, checking on the cattle, negotiating prices with buyers, and dealing with the endless details that came with moving a herd. But his mind was elsewhere, counting down the hours until he could ride out to see Eliza again. When evening finally came, he cleaned up as best he could, washing the dust from his face and hands, and headed out to her dugout. She was waiting for him, and the smile she gave him when he arrived made the long day worthwhile. This time he brought supplies with him, flour and sugar and fresh vegetables from the market. Eliza tried to protest, but Cole would not hear it. "Think of it as payment for your cooking," he said. "Best meal I've had in months." They fell into an easy routine over the next few days. Cole would work during the day, and in the evening he would ride out to Eliza's dugout. They would eat together, and afterward they would sit outside and watch the sun set over the prairie. Cole would talk, telling her about his life, his dreams of having his own ranch, his memories of growing up in Missouri before the war. And Eliza would listen, her eyes fixed on his face, occasionally nodding or shaking her head, sometimes reaching out to touch his hand when he said something that particularly moved her. Slowly, Cole began to understand her silent language. He learned that when she looked down and to the left, she was sad or troubled. When her eyes crinkled at the corners, she was amused. When she met his gaze directly and held it, she was being completely honest with him, showing him her true self without any barriers. He found that he could read her expressions more clearly than he could read most people who had full use of their voices. One evening, about a week after they had met, Cole brought her something special. It was a slate and some chalk, the kind schoolchildren used for their lessons. Eliza looked at it with confusion, and Cole explained. "I thought maybe I could teach you to write," he said. "Just simple things at first, your name, basic words. It might make things easier for you." Eliza's eyes filled with tears, and she pressed her hand to her mouth, overwhelmed. No one had ever offered to teach her anything before. As a slave, she had been forbidden from learning to read or write. After gaining her freedom, she had been too busy surviving to even think about education. The fact that Cole thought she was worth teaching, that he believed she could learn, meant more to her than any gift could have. They started that very night. Cole showed her how to hold the chalk, how to form the letters of her name. It was slow work. Eliza's hand was unused to writing, and the shapes of letters were foreign to her. But she was determined, and Cole was patient. By the end of the evening, she had managed to write a shaky but recognizable Eliza on the slate. She showed it to Cole with such pride that he felt his throat tighten with emotion. On impulse, he reached out and pulled her into a hug. She stiffened for just a moment, surprised, and then she relaxed against him, her arms coming up to wrap around his waist. They stood like that for a long time, holding each other in the gathering darkness, and Cole knew with absolute certainty that he was falling in love with her. The realization should have frightened him. He had always been a careful man, someone who thought things through before acting. Love was a complication he had not planned for, especially not love with a woman who faced challenges that most people could not even imagine. But as he held Eliza in his arms, feeling her warmth and her strength, he found that he did not care about the complications. All he cared about was being with her, protecting her, building a life with her. Over the following weeks, their relationship deepened. Cole continued to teach Eliza to write, and she proved to be a quick learner. Soon she could write simple sentences, questions and answers that made their communication easier. But more than that, Cole was learning to read her in ways that went beyond words. He could tell her mood from the way she moved, could sense when something was troubling her by a slight tension in her shoulders. He learned the meaning of every small gesture, every expression that crossed her face. Eliza, for her part, was amazed by Cole's kindness and patience. She had learned to expect cruelty from the world, or at best indifference. But Cole treated her with a gentleness and respect that she had never experienced before. He never spoke down to her or treated her as if her disability made her less than whole. Instead, he seemed to see past the surface to the person she truly was, the woman who had survived horrors and still retained the capacity for joy and hope. One evening, as they sat outside her dugout watching fireflies dance in the twilight, Cole took Eliza's hand in his. He had been thinking about what he wanted to say all day, rehearsing the words in his mind. Now, looking into her green eyes, he felt his carefully prepared speech evaporate. "Eliza," he said softly, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to really hear me." She turned to face him fully, giving him her complete attention in the way that always made him feel like the most important person in the world. "I'm in love with you," Cole said simply. "I know we haven't known each other long, and I know there are people who would say this is crazy or impossible. But I don't care what anyone else thinks. I love you, Eliza. I love your strength and your courage. I love the way you see the world and the way you've fought to make a place for yourself in it. I love how you can say more with your eyes than most people can say with 1,000 words. Tears spilled down Eliza's cheeks, catching the last rays of sunlight. She pulled her hand from his and reached for the slate she now kept nearby. With shaking hands, she wrote 3 words and showed them to him. I love you too, the slate read. Cole felt joy surge through him, pure and overwhelming. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears, and then he kissed her. It was a gentle kiss at first, tentative and sweet, but it quickly deepened as Eliza responded, her hands coming up to grip his shirt, pulling him closer. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Cole rested his forehead against hers. Marry me, he said. I know I don't have much yet, just some savings and my horse and gear, but I'm going to buy land, build a real house. I want to build a life with you, Eliza. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep holding you every night. I want to grow old with you. Will you marry me? Eliza pulled back just enough to look into his eyes, searching for any sign of doubt or uncertainty. Finding none, she smiled through her tears and nodded vigorously. Then she grabbed the slate again and wrote, Yes, yes, yes. Cole laughed and pulled her into his arms, spinning her around while she clung to him, her silent laughter evident in the way her shoulders shook and her eyes sparkled with joy. When he set her down, she was beaming at him with such happiness that Cole felt his heart might burst. They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the church in Abilene. The preacher had been hesitant at first, concerned about Eliza's inability to speak her vows. But Cole had been insistent, and eventually the preacher agreed that written vows were just as binding as spoken ones. Eliza wore a new dress that Cole had bought for her, simple blue calico that brought out the color of her eyes, and she carried a bouquet of wildflowers that Cole had picked that morning. There were no guests at the wedding except for 2 of Cole's fellow drovers who stood as witnesses. But neither Cole nor Eliza cared about the lack of ceremony or celebration. All that mattered was the commitment they were making to each other, the promise to stand together no matter what challenges they might face. After the wedding, Cole moved his few possessions into Eliza's dugout. It was cramped with 2 people, but neither of them minded. They were too busy discovering each other, learning the rhythms of married life, building the foundation of their future together. Cole continued working as a drover that season, but every penny he earned went into their savings. He was determined to buy land, good land with water and grass, where they could build a ranch and a real home. Eliza worked too, taking in laundry and doing sewing for the women in town. Some people refused to hire her because of her disability, but others saw the quality of her work and did not care that she could not speak. They saved aggressively, living on very little, putting aside almost everything they earned. By the end of that first summer, they had enough for a down payment on land. Cole spent weeks riding around the area, looking at different properties, evaluating water sources and grass and proximity to markets. Finally, he found the perfect place, a quarter section of land about 10 miles south of Abilene with a creek running through it and rich soil. When he showed it to Eliza, riding out with her on a borrowed wagon, he watched her face anxiously, hoping she would love it as much as he did. She climbed down from the wagon and walked through the tall grass, her hands trailing through the seed heads, her face tilted up to the sun. When she turned back to Cole, her eyes were shining. She came to him and took his hands, placing them over her heart so he could feel it beating. Then she pointed to the land to him, to herself, making a circle that encompassed everything. Cole understood. This was not just land to her. It was their future, their dream made real, a place where they could build something permanent and good. They bought the land that week, signing papers at the land office with Eliza carefully writing her name in the space provided. Cole noticed the clerk's surprise at seeing a woman's name on the deed alongside his own, but he stared the man down until he finished processing the paperwork without comment. This was their land, held jointly, and Cole wanted Eliza to know that she was an equal partner in everything they built. The first year was brutally hard. They lived in a tent while Cole built a small cabin, working from dawn to dusk cutting timber and fitting logs. Eliza helped where she could, mixing mud for chinking, carrying water, preparing meals. When the cabin was finally finished, it was just 2 rooms, but it felt like a palace compared to the dugout. They had a real floor, real windows with glass panes, and a solid roof that did not leak. Cole bought a few head of cattle with their remaining savings, foundation stock for what he hoped would eventually be a real herd. He built a small barn and corrals, working through the fall and into the winter to get everything ready before the worst weather hit. That first winter in their new home was both challenging and wonderful. Snow fell heavily, sometimes trapping them inside for days at a time, but Cole and Eliza did not mind. They spent those days talking, or rather, Cole talking while Eliza wrote responses on her slate or communicated with the gestures and expressions that had become their private language. Cole continued to teach Eliza, and her writing improved dramatically. She began reading too, slowly working her way through the books that Cole bought for her whenever he went to town. Her favorite was a collection of poetry, and sometimes she would copy out verses that particularly moved her, showing them to Cole and pointing to lines that expressed feelings she could not voice. It was during one of these quiet evenings, sitting by the fire while snow howled outside, that Eliza showed Cole something she had written on her slate. "Baby coming," it said. Cole stared at the words for a long moment, not quite believing what he was reading. Then he looked up at Eliza, who was watching him with a mixture of joy and nervousness. "You're going to have a baby?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're going to have a baby." Eliza nodded, tears streaming down her face, and Cole let out a whoop of joy that probably scared every animal within a mile radius. He swept Eliza up in his arms, careful not to hold her too tight, kissing her face and laughing, when he asked, "How long have you known?" Eliza took the slate back and wrote, 2 months, baby come summer. Cole did some quick calculations in his head. Summer. They would have a baby by summer. He was going to be a father. The realization filled him with a mixture of joy and terror. He knew nothing about babies, about raising children. But looking at Eliza's glowing face, he felt his doubts fade. They would figure it out together the same way they had figured out everything else. The pregnancy was not easy. Eliza suffered from terrible morning sickness in the early months, made worse by the fact that she could not call out for help when she needed it. Cole learned to sleep lightly, waking at the slightest change in her breathing, ready to help her if she needed him. As her belly grew, she had trouble sleeping, and Cole would rub her back and feet for hours, trying to ease her discomfort. But despite the challenges, Eliza bloomed. She seemed to grow more beautiful with each passing week, her skin glowing, her eyes bright with anticipation. She sewed tiny clothes and blankets, preparing for the baby's arrival with meticulous care. Cole built a cradle, spending hours sanding and finishing the wood until it was smooth as silk, safe for delicate baby skin. As summer approached, Cole became increasingly anxious. He had arranged for a midwife from town to come when the time arrived, but he worried constantly about what could go wrong. Childbirth was dangerous under the best circumstances, and Eliza's inability to speak added another layer of complication. How would she be able to tell them if something was wrong, if she was in unbearable pain? Eliza seemed to sense his worry, and one evening she took his hand and placed it on her swollen belly. Cole felt the baby kick, a strong, insistent movement that made him catch his breath. Eliza smiled at him and wrote on her slate, "Baby strong, I strong, we be fine." Cole wanted to believe her, but he could not shake his fear. He had already lost so much in his life, had seen so much death during the war and in the hard years that followed. The thought of losing Eliza was unbearable, a darkness that threatened to swallow him whole. The baby came on a hot July morning, arriving 3 weeks earlier than expected. Cole woke to find Eliza gripping his arm, her face contorted with pain. She pointed to her belly, then made a downward motion, and Cole understood immediately. The baby was coming. He jumped out of bed and pulled on his pants, his hands shaking as he struggled with the buttons. He needed to ride to town to fetch the midwife. But Eliza grabbed his arm and shook her head frantically, pointing to the bed. The baby was coming now, too fast for him to get help. Cole felt panic rise in his throat, but he forced it down. Eliza needed him to be calm, to be strong. He could do this. He had to do this. He helped Eliza back into bed, gathering clean linens and water, trying to remember everything he had ever heard about delivering babies. It was not much. He had helped with calving before, but he knew that human birth was different, more complicated. The labor was intense and frighteningly fast. Eliza could not cry out, but Cole saw the pain in her face, in the way her body tensed with each contraction. He held her hand, letting her squeeze until his bones ached, murmuring words of encouragement and love. He told her how strong she was, how brave, how much he loved her and believed in her. And then, just as the sun was fully rising, painting the cabin walls with golden light, their baby was born. Cole caught the tiny, slippery body in his hands, his heart nearly stopping when the baby did not immediately cry. But then, as if sensing his panic, the infant let out a loud, indignant wail, and Cole felt tears of relief stream down his face. "It's a boy," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "Eliza, we have a son." He placed the baby on Eliza's chest, and she wrapped her arms around the tiny body, her face transformed by a love so intense it seemed to radiate from her like light. She looked up at Cole with tears streaming down her face, and he saw in her eyes everything that words could never express. Joy and relief and gratitude, and a love so deep it had no bottom. Cole took care of everything else that needed to be done, drawing on half-remembered instructions and pure instinct. When everything was cleaned up and Eliza and the baby were both resting comfortably, he finally allowed himself to collapse into a chair, his whole body shaking with delayed reaction. They named the baby James, after Cole's father. He was a healthy child with a strong set of lungs and his mother's green eyes. Eliza took to motherhood with the same determination she brought to everything else in her life. Her inability to speak presented some challenges, especially in those first exhausting weeks when the baby seemed to cry constantly. But Cole learned to interpret different types of cries, and Eliza developed her own methods of soothing their son, humming without words, a vibration in her chest that James seemed to find comforting. As James grew, he seemed to understand from the very beginning that his mother communicated differently. He learned to watch her face, to read her expressions and gestures. By the time he was 2 years old, he understood her as well as Cole did, perhaps even better. He would bring her things when she pointed, would come running when she clapped her hands in a particular pattern that meant she needed him. The ranch grew slowly but steadily. Cole worked harder than he had ever worked in his life, building up the herd, improving the land, adding to the buildings. Eliza managed the household and helped with the ranch work whenever she could, all while caring for James. They were exhausted most of the time, but they were also happy, building something real and lasting together. When James was 3, Eliza became pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, and when the baby came, another boy they named Daniel, the midwife was there to help. Daniel was a quieter baby than James had been, with Cole's dark hair and a serious expression that made him seem older than his months. Life settled into a rhythm. The boys grew, the ranch prospered, and Cole and Eliza's love deepened with each passing year. They developed their own language, a combination of gestures, expressions, and written words that was as rich and complex as any spoken conversation. Cole found that he preferred this form of communication in many ways. It required them to really pay attention to each other, to be fully present in each moment. There was no room for misunderstanding when every message had to be carefully conveyed and received. The boys grew up understanding that their mother was different, but they never saw her disability as a weakness. Instead, they saw her strength, her intelligence, her capacity for love. They learned sign language without realizing they were learning it, developing their own family system of communication that outsiders found baffling, but that worked perfectly for them. When James was 6 and Daniel was 3, something happened that reminded them all how precious their peace was. A man came to the ranch, a well-dressed gentleman from back east who was buying up land in the area. He made Cole an offer for their property, a generous offer by any standard, but Cole refused without hesitation. This was their home, the place where they had built their life together. It was not for sale at any price. The man left, but not before making some disparaging comments about Eliza, suggesting that Cole could do better, that he should not be tied to a woman who could not even speak. Cole had to restrain himself from physically throwing the man off their property. After he left, Cole found Eliza in the garden, tears streaming down her face. She had heard every word. Cole knelt beside her and took her face in his hands, making sure she was looking directly into his eyes. "Listen to me," he said fiercely. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me. You are the strongest, bravest, most beautiful person I know. The way you communicate is not a disability, it's a gift. You've taught me to really see people, to pay attention, to listen with more than just my ears." Our boys are growing up with that same gift, learning to read people and situations in ways that most folks never do. That man doesn't know anything about what we have, about what we've built together, and his opinion means nothing to me. All that matters is you and me and our boys. Do you understand? Eliza nodded, more tears flowing, but Cole could see in her eyes that she believed him. She pulled him close and held him tight, and they stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms while the boys played nearby and the sun moved slowly across the sky. As the years passed, the ranch continued to grow. Cole hired help, young men who were respectful and hardworking, who treated Eliza with the courtesy she deserved. The herd expanded to several hundred head, and they added chickens and pigs and a milk cow. They planted an orchard, apple and peach trees that would take years to bear fruit, but that represented their faith in the future. James grew into a bright, curious boy who loved books and learning. Cole and Eliza taught him to read and write, and he devoured every book they could get for him. Daniel was more interested in the ranch work, spending hours with his father learning about cattle and horses. Both boys adored their mother and were fiercely protective of her, quickly shutting down anyone who dared to mock or belittle her. When James was 10 and Daniel was 7, Eliza surprised Cole with another pregnancy. She was 32 by then, and Cole worried about the risks of childbirth at her age. But Eliza was healthy and strong, and she faced the pregnancy with her usual determination. This time, they had a daughter, a tiny, delicate girl with blonde hair and blue eyes that seemed to shift between gray and green depending on the light. They named her Sarah, and she wrapped her father around her little finger from the moment she was born. Cole, who had always been competent and calm, turned into a nervous wreck whenever Sarah so much as sneezed. Eliza found his anxiety amusing, often catching his eye and giving him a look that clearly said he was being ridiculous. Sarah grew up absolutely devoted to her mother, following Eliza everywhere, mimicking her gestures and expressions. By the time she could walk, she was helping in the garden, chattering away in a mixture of words and signs that made perfect sense to her family, even if outsiders found it incomprehensible. The years rolled on, bringing both joys and sorrows. They lost cattle to drought and disease, faced financial struggles and harsh winters. Cole's health wavered one terrible winter when he fell through ice while trying to rescue a calf, developing pneumonia that nearly killed him. Eliza nursed him through it with a devotion that moved him to tears, sitting by his bedside day and night, refusing to leave his side even when the boys begged her to rest. When he recovered, weak but alive, Cole realized anew how much Eliza meant to him. She was not just his wife, not just the mother of his children. She was his partner in the truest sense, the person who made every challenge bearable and every joy sweeter. The fact that she communicated differently than others had long since ceased to matter. He could not imagine loving anyone more completely than he loved her. The boys grew into young men. James went away to school, determined to become a lawyer. It was a bold ambition for a ranch boy, but Cole and Eliza encouraged him, proud of his intelligence and drive. Daniel stayed on the ranch, working alongside his father, learning the business from the ground up. He had a natural gift with animals, a patience and understanding that made even the most difficult horses gentle under his hands. Sarah grew into a beautiful young woman, creative and artistic, with her mother's strength and her father's gentle nature. She learned to paint and draw, creating pictures that captured the beauty of their ranch and the prairie around them. She was courted by several young men from the area, but she was in no hurry to marry, content to help her parents and work on her art. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Cole took Eliza on a trip, their first real vacation since they had married. They left the ranch in Daniel and Sarah's capable hands and traveled to Denver, where they stayed in a real hotel and ate in restaurants and went to the theater. Eliza was nervous about being in the city, worried about how people would react to her disability. But Cole never left her side, translating for her when needed, glaring down anyone who stared too long or showed disrespect. One evening, they attended a lecture about the abolition movement and the ongoing work for civil rights. The speaker talked about the horrors of slavery, the brutality that had been inflicted on millions of people. As Cole listened, holding Eliza's hand, he thought about what she had suffered, the price she had paid for speaking truth. He looked at her profile in the dimly lit hall, seeing the strength in the set of her jaw, the intelligence in her eyes, and he felt overwhelmed with love and admiration. After the lecture, they walked back to their hotel through streets lit by gas lamps, watching people pass by in their evening finery. Cole stopped in a quiet spot and turned to face Eliza, taking both her hands in his. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Something I should probably say more often. You are the most remarkable person I have ever known. What was done to you was evil and wrong, an attempt to silence you, to rob you of your voice and your power. But they failed, Eliza. They didn't break you. You found another voice, a stronger one. You speak through your actions, through the way you love our children, through the life we've built together. You speak through your eyes, and I hear every word you say, clearer than any words that could be spoken. I am so proud to be your husband, so grateful for every day I get to spend with you." Eliza's eyes filled with tears, and she pulled one hand free to touch Cole's face, her fingers tracing the lines that time and hard work had etched there. Then she pulled out the small notebook she always carried now instead of the slate. She wrote quickly and showed it to him. "You saved me," it read. "Not just that day in town, but every day since. You saw me when I was invisible. You heard me when I had no voice. You loved me when I thought I was unlovable. You gave me a life I never dreamed possible. I love you more than words could ever say, even if I had 1,000 tongues." Cole pulled her into his arms, holding her close while city life bustled around them, and he knew that no matter what the future brought, they would face it together. They had survived everything life had thrown at them so far, and they would continue to survive, to thrive, because they had each other. They returned home to find the ranch running smoothly. James came home for a visit, full of stories about his studies and his work clerking for a judge. Daniel had started courting a girl from a neighboring ranch, a sweet, hard-working young woman who treated Eliza with warmth and respect. Sarah had completed a series of paintings depicting life on the ranch, and a merchant in town wanted to display them in his store. Life continued its rhythm of seasons and years. They celebrated births and mourned deaths, watched their children grow and build their own lives. James became a successful lawyer, using his skills to help people who could not afford representation. He married a teacher, a woman who shared his passion for justice and education. Daniel married his sweetheart and brought her to live on the ranch, building a house nearby so he could continue working with his father. Sarah eventually married a newspaperman from Abilene, a kind man who appreciated her art and her spirit. Cole and Eliza became grandparents, delighting in the parade of grandchildren who filled their home with noise and laughter. They taught the grandchildren the family's special way of communicating, and the children accepted it without question, understanding that their grandmother spoke with her hands and her eyes, and that this was simply how things were in their family. As they grew older, Cole and Eliza spent more time simply being together, sitting on the porch of the ranch house they had expanded over the years, watching the sun set over land they had worked and loved. They no longer needed words or even gestures to communicate. A lifetime together had given them an understanding that went beyond language, a connection that was deeper than speech. One evening, when Cole was 68 and Eliza was 66, they sat together watching a storm roll in across the prairie. Lightning flickered in the distance, and thunder rumbled like distant drums. Eliza rested her head on Cole's shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "You remember the first time I saw you?" Cole asked. "Outside that general store in Abilene trying to buy supplies." Eliza nodded against his shoulder. "I knew right then that you were special," Cole continued. "I didn't know how special, didn't know that you would change my entire life, but I felt it, that pull toward you, like something in me recognized something in you." Eliza pulled back so she could look at him, and the expression in her eyes was so full of love that Cole felt his breath catch. She touched his face, then her own, then made a gesture that encompassed the ranch, their children and grandchildren, their entire life together. Cole understood perfectly. She was saying that they were meant to be, that everything they had experienced, all the hardship and joy, had been worth it because it had brought them to this moment. "I love you," Cole said. "I will love you until my last breath and beyond." Eliza smiled and kissed him, a gentle kiss that held 40 years of love and partnership. Then she settled back against his shoulder, and they watched the storm approach together, the way they had faced everything else in their lives, side by side, united in a bond that no force could break. The years continued to pass, each one bringing changes. Cole's hair turned completely white, and his hands grew gnarled with arthritis. Eliza's face became lined with wrinkles, each one earned through years of laughter and tears, but their love never wavered, never diminished. If anything, it grew stronger, deepened by time and shared experience. Daniel took over more of the ranch work as Cole's strength faded. James continued his legal practice, making a name for himself defending the rights of the vulnerable and voiceless. Sarah's art gained recognition beyond their small corner of Kansas, and she held exhibitions in Denver and even as far as San Francisco. All three children remained close to their parents, visiting often, bringing their own children to learn from the grandparents who had built something beautiful out of hardship. When Cole was 74, he fell ill with a fever that would not break. The doctor came from town and did what he could, but everyone knew that Cole's time was running short. He lingered for several days, drifting in and out of consciousness, and Eliza never left his side. She sat by his bed, holding his hand, her eyes speaking all the things that she could not say aloud. On the third day, Cole woke from a troubled sleep to find Eliza watching him, tears streaming down her face. He squeezed her hand weakly. "Don't cry," he whispered. "We had a good life, didn't we?" "Better than I ever dreamed possible." Eliza nodded, her whole body shaking with suppressed sobs. She pressed his hand to her cheek, and Cole felt the wetness of her tears on his skin. "I need you to know something," Cole said, his voice barely audible. "Meeting you was the best thing that ever happened to me. Loving you, building a life with you, raising our children with you, it's been the greatest privilege of my life. You are the bravest, strongest, most beautiful person I have ever known. They tried to silence you, but you found a voice more powerful than any words. You spoke to my heart, and I heard every word." Eliza pulled his hand to her lips, kissing his palm, her tears falling freely now. Cole smiled at her, his eyes already starting to drift closed again. "I'll wait for you," he murmured. "On the other side, I'll be waiting." He died that evening as the sun was setting, surrounded by his family but holding only Eliza's hand. She felt the moment his spirit left, felt the final squeeze of his fingers before they went lax. She pressed her face to his chest, her body shaking with silent sobs, mourning the loss of the man who had seen her when she was invisible, who had loved her when the world told her she was unlovable. The funeral was large, attended by people from all over the county. Cole had been respected and liked, known for his fairness and kindness. But Eliza barely noticed the crowds. She sat through the service in a fog of grief, feeling as if half of herself had been torn away. The weeks after Cole's death were the hardest of Eliza's life. She had survived slavery, had survived having her tongue cut out, had survived poverty and hardship. But surviving without Cole felt impossible. The ranch house felt empty without his presence, without his voice filling the rooms, without his hand reaching for hers in the darkness. But slowly, with the help of her children and grandchildren, Eliza found her way back to life. She discovered that Cole was still with her in a way, present in the ranch they had built together, in the children they had raised, in the legacy of love they had created. She could feel him in the wind that blew across the prairie, could sense his presence in the sunset they had watched together so many times. She lived for another 8 years after Cole's death, years filled with the love of her family and the satisfaction of seeing the ranch continue to prosper under Daniel's management. She watched her grandchildren grow up, saw some of them marry and have children of their own. She continued to paint with Sarah, capturing memories on canvas, preserving the beauty of the life she and Cole had built. When Eliza finally passed away in her sleep at the age of 74, her children found a letter tucked among her belongings. It was written in her careful handwriting, pages and pages of thoughts she had wanted to share. The letter told the story of her life, from the horrors of slavery to the miracle of finding Cole. But the last page was addressed to Cole himself, a final message to the man who had loved her so completely. "My dearest Cole," it read, "I am coming to find you now. I have had a good life since you left, surrounded by our children and grandchildren, watching the ranch we built continue to thrive. But I have missed you every moment of every day. I have missed your voice, your touch, the way you looked at me like I was the most precious thing in the world. You taught me that silence is not the same as voicelessness, that a person can speak volumes without uttering a single word. You showed me that love does not require perfect words, only perfect understanding. You gave me a life I never dreamed possible, a family, a home, a love that sustained me through everything. I am grateful for every moment we had together, and I cannot wait to see you again. Wait for me, my love. I am coming home." They buried Eliza next to Cole on a hill overlooking the ranch, under the wide Kansas sky they had both loved. The entire family gathered, along with friends and neighbors, to say goodbye to the woman who had overcome so much, who had built such a beautiful life, despite the cruelty that had been done to her. As the sun set over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, they all felt certain that Eliza and Cole were together again, reunited at last, speaking in that perfect language of love that transcends all barriers. The ranch continued to thrive for generations, passed down through the family, each new generation hearing the story of Cole and Eliza, of the cowboy who learned to read eyes instead of lips, of the woman who spoke truth even after her tongue was cut out, of a love that proved stronger than any silence. The story became a legend in the family, a reminder that real communication comes from the heart, that love can overcome any obstacle, and that sometimes the most powerful voice is the one that never makes a sound. And on quiet evenings, when the wind blows across the prairie and the sun sets in a blaze of glory, people swear they can still feel the presence of Cole and Eliza on that ranch. Two souls so deeply connected that not even death could separate them, their love echoing through the generations like a song without words, beautiful and eternal and true.